back. Phill Lindsay returns to Minneapolis City Cable with this, the premiere edition of On Cue, the program that explores our urban environments. Phil's guests include Nick Koch, talking about basic terms and issues relating to our urban environments. Peggy Booth, sharing her history and knowledge of Minneapolis' Committee on Urban Environments, and Janet Abrams, describing the mission and activities of the University of Minnesota's Design Institute. Plus, persons on the street with interviews and something about stucco. All this and a bit more on Cue, August 2002. From City Hall, downtown Minneapolis, here's your host, Phill Lindsay.
Hello, welcome to On Cue, the program that explores our urban environment. I'm your host, Phill Lindsay. And because of the nature of this show, we will always be on location. You'll never find us in a studio. Now later on, our guests will include Janet Abrams from the University of Minnesota's Design Institute, Peggy Booth, who's a veteran of the Committee on Urban Environment. She'll be talking about the history and some of the key people that went into making Cue what it is today. And our first guest, Nick Koch, will be talking about some of the issues and the terms that go into the very thing we call our urban environment. Now I'll be back with Nick right after we go out and see an interesting Cue fact. Stay tuned. And welcome back. We're always going to have something interesting to say about Cue and some of its history and those Cue facts. I'm very pleased for our very first guest on the first premiere edition here of On Cue to have as my guest Nick Koch. Nick, it's nice to have you here. And Nick professionally is with Hamel, Green, and Abramson, but there's more to Nick as well. How would you describe your career and your life?
Well, thank you for asking. You know, we define our lives and our careers separately. I live in South Minneapolis where I'm raising two great kids, but my career, especially as regards to Cue, does tie with architecture, design, urban planning, and policy. Yes, I do work at HGA, which is a great base for me to operate from and fulfill my passions because the firm is so oriented to great design, and design is clearly one of the underlying issues with cities. Through my work, though, I've been able to participate in the Urban Land Institute, which is a forum for developers, designers, financiers, and policymakers. And the Urban Land Institute, or ULI, is really geared toward urban development and redevelopment and all the issues that make great cities. I also chair the AIA's Urban Design Committee, our local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And finally, I serve on the Met Council's Livable Communities Advisory Committee. The theme there, of course, deals with development, community, cities, all things that have been lifelong interests for me.
So you're really operating personally and professionally, it sounds like, at the intersection of design, development, and public policy, helping folks in all three of those arenas kind of find some balance. How would you describe that effort?
You've just articulated my keystone, and I just have to say it's so important, the intersection of having good design, good development, and good policy. Where those three come together is a magic point for the success of cities. It's a place where you find human value and economic value, and I think it's a centerpiece of what I do.
Are you originally from the Twin Cities?
No, I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and maybe that's where I got some of my urban sensibilities. But speaking of location, I think it's interesting to note that at City Hall, we're just one floor below the planning department, and
right.
I'd like to use that as a reminder or an entree to think about the importance of planning and visions in creating great cities. Because ultimately we are about creating a great competitive city, a great competitive region. I think that people have to shift their thinking in terms of a self-definition of community and understanding that it's Minneapolis, it's the St. Paul, it's the suburbs, it's our whole region that needs to compete with the Denvers and the Seattles and the Dallases of the world. And so these And it gets back to design, development, and policy. These dimensions are important dimensions of competition.
I'm very much with you on that. I've often thought, for instance, that the so-called competition between the two cities is a false one. There's really a lot more in common that Minneapolis and St. Paul have in terms of their challenges and opportunities.
If we look at issues from a regional policy perspective, I don't know what famous person said, we must all hang together or we will surely hang separately. But you know, that statement, we are as a region inexorably linked. Since we're a place which has, shall we say, we're climatically, meteorologically impaired, we've got to have something extra to offer. The person who is mobile, we have knowledge workers are mobile, capital is mobile, and since we live in such a competitive global environment, again, getting back to the urban environment, we've got to have something to offer that can one-up our competition.
Yeah. Why here as opposed to somewhere else?
Exactly.
Indulge me, if you will, this being, again, our first edition of On Cue. We use the term our urban environment. Could you take a stab at just what that means to you? Our urban, what is it? What are the elements? What are the main features?
One feature is the intersection of the public realm and the private realm, and I think at its core this may be the most important feature. If we look at cities and what shapes cities, there's a structure. Now, a European city that might be 1,000 or 2,000 years old has a structure that's evolved over time through tradition, perhaps accidents of geography. In this country and in a relatively young city like Minneapolis, we've made urban structural decisions that have shaped the success of our city. For example, 120 years ago, somebody made great decisions about a chain of lakes, about the fact that these lakes would not be some rich person's backyard, but part of the expanded community, connecting the lakes, a policy decision that said no place in Minneapolis will be more than roughly 6 blocks from a park. That was a policy decision which shaped the structure of our city, and it's something that makes our city more competitive, and it's an aspect of our urban environment. You know, we need to be really clear that the urban environment is the human-made environment, the built environment, the public realm, the private realm, and the natural environment, and all these things that come together in a diverse, exciting, complicated, and sometimes contentious setting are what make our city great.
Again, those competing interests have to come into some balance that you were talking about earlier.
Yes, and that's where the importance of planning, design, and development and policy come to bear.
You and I talked earlier, and I wanted to ask you a question that you brought up, at least a topic. What are some of the greatest challenges, or maybe the greatest challenge you see for either this city or this region, in terms of design, development, or policy setting, since that's part of that triumvirate you talk about?
Well, that's a hard question, and I can only give you a partial answer right now. But I think, especially if we look at the last legislative session and some of the issues of regionalism, I honestly think that we need to start thinking and working together. And you know, that sounds like such a trite statement. We need to work together, but it's true. We need to take competing interests and align them and get people thinking about us as being a competitive region. Just one last quick thing to throw out there. I think you might want to look forward in future programs to something the Met Council is doing with its 2030 regional blueprint. Again, it's a way of linking transportation, policy, housing, development, the natural environment, the public realm, and the private realm into one whole that will just make us a more successful city and a more successful region.
Well said. We have less than a minute left. If the average citizen listened to this and wanted to just know more or get involved, where ought they to look?
Well, typically one refers persons to websites.
Sure.
But, you know, and I'll throw out a few, but, you know, quite frankly, the Star Tribune has been doing a great series of editorials advancing thinking about where we are as a community. I'd pay attention to the editorial page. I'd suggest that people really stay involved in the political process this year and observe what's going on in policy, particularly in transportation. And I guess I'll throw in a plug for the Urban Land Institute and its website. www.uli.org, and just pay attention.
That
Just
sounds
pay
great.
attention.
Nick Koch, thank you very
Great.
much.
Pleasure. Thanks
Good
a lot.
introduction to
All
what
right.
this is all about.
Glad to help, Phil.
Well, we'll be back in a little bit. Later on in the show, we've got Janet Abrams from the University of Minnesota's Design Institute, and just before her, we've got Peggy Booth to talk about Q, some of its history. But first, we've got something interesting to share with you about stucco.
Hi, my name is Laurel Ulland, and I'm an architect with Domain Architecture and Design. We're located in the uptown area of Minneapolis, and I've been asked to comment on why is there so much stucco used in the Twin Cities, and in Minneapolis in particular. I think, you know, many of the homes were built in the Twin Cities at the turn of the century, and if you drive around Minneapolis, you'll see many period revival homes from the early 1900s, you know, the Tudor style with its timber and stucco facade, and you know, the English manor house. You'll think of the Cotswold cottage look and the French manor look, and even our American bungalow style and prairie school style relied on stucco as its exterior cladding. You know, you also see many homes that have wood siding on it, you know, the old Victorians of the turn of the century and colonial revivals. As these homes aged, they actually the siding needed to be replaced or, you know, maintained in some way, and oftentimes the owners started looking for another solution. And we might all be familiar with, you know, the salesman that sold aluminum siding and vinyl siding in the 50s and 60s, but likewise, I think stucco became a solution for many of these homes that had originally been clad in wood siding. And I've actually picked a house today for a setting that was built in 1905. It's a 4-square style home, and it originally had wood siding. And the owners, as they contemplated a renovation in, you know, the mid-90s, decided to use stucco instead of wood siding because of, one, its durability and its low maintenance, but also because it's become a very economical material.
Well, I, for one, always wanted to know more about stucco, and as the shows go on with On Cue, we're going to bring you more interesting facts about things that are kind of that aha factor. Our next guest on this show is someone who's got a lot to say and a lot of experience with the Committee on Urban Environment. Peggy Booth, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Phil.
And we are going to talk about Q, but you also right now are a regional manager for the Department of Natural Resources.
Yep, in Metro Region.
Metro Region,
Yeah, and we have programs with communities on urban forestry. We have some fire concerns. We work with others on conserving trees in the face of development.
Well, in fact, that's actually a good transition into some of your earliest work with Q. Can I say, going back to about the mid-70s,
That's right.
when we were devastated with Dutch elm disease.
Yeah, Q, and in particular its Shade Tree Committee, was really on the forefront of getting Elm Watch going, a way that the Park Board and others who are responsible for trees wanted to get the citizens out there, all these eyes looking for trees with Dutch elm disease. And at that time, I was working as an urban designer and landscape architect at the Minneapolis Planning Department, and we were doing plans, in this case with the Whittier neighborhood, and realized that there wasn't a plan for replacing the elm trees. The city, yes, they were replanting trees, but there wasn't attention to species diversity and aesthetics and other concerns. So it seemed like a real ripe opportunity for me as a staff person to get involved, and I've always had a very strong commitment to working with citizenry and was aware of Q, working in the planning department, and so asked Q if they wanted to be involved with being really the overall advisors and the people that set out what are our objectives, what are the criteria that we want to achieve in reforesting our city.
And just to orient our viewers, at this point in the mid-70s, Q had been around since, what, about 68 formally, I think?
Yes, yeah.
And had it always been housed, as it were, in the planning department?
I don't know if it was always housed in the planning department, but there was a very strong connection between planning and Q. The person that really brought me to Q was Norma Olson, who was a former planning commission member and who was a chair of Q. And so I think with people like Art Naftalin and with Norma and others, there was this strong commitment to be a citizen advisor to the city council, the mayor, and to the planning department.
And indeed, it sounds like you then served as that good resource to your specific efforts, and it sounds also in partnership with the Park and Recreation Board.
Yeah, it was a very unique situation. I'd been working as a planner for a number of years for the city, and there was really a special joint agreement between the mayor's office, under which planning was at that time, and the park board, that I, as a designer, could develop the overall boulevard reforestation plan, that the park would provide some interns, and together we drove up and down every single street, mapped all kinds of different maps for every street of the city. I remember having meetings with about 50 neighborhood groups talking about their specific thing. And then, so it was the park board, the mayor's office and planning, and then sort of the third leg of the stool representing the broad citizen perspective was Q.
That's great, and enough time's gone on now that you can probably look back, because it's been a generation, 25 years. And I know as I drive down our streets, I mean, that canopy has sort of been reclaimed from that, that early...
Well, and it was a very interesting mind shift for all of us. We'd had nothing but elm trees that, you know, have a glorious canopy. And then we were moving to a diversity of trees. But the city, and I think Q really had a major influence on this, decided that it wanted to continue to have continuity of a single species down one street, but then make sure the next street over and the next street over and the next street over had different types of trees, so that from a neighborhood perspective, you would get overall species diversity.
And I know in the spring, I love going from street to street and seeing the different shades of green, for instance, as they're budding.
Yeah, or one street will be in flower, or in another street will have a different unique character. Maybe it's a later flower or it's fall color.
Now, Peggy, I know you work with some other folks that help get some key things going. Nate Siegel, for instance. And you folks helped with a really neat program that's carrying on to this day.
Well, Nate Siegel was an elderly retired gentleman coming out of the business community who was a full Q member. And a number of us on the Shade Tree Committee wanted to see more planting in general, things happening out there along with the boulevard trees where the public could really appreciate them. Nate's perspective was more coming out of the Neighborhood Environment Committee of Q, and we really put our heads together and said, what can we do to get more people planting flowers in their front yards, in community open spaces, and on the boulevards? And I remember a handful of us really came up with the idea of the Blooming Boulevards program, and just drove around and begged and borrowed for nominations that first year. There were probably only a half dozen or so. And then the program literally blossomed from that. And it was very shortly after it started that Nate Siegel himself passed away, and we decided to name the top award for Blooming Boulevards the Nate Siegel Award.
Which is to this day the award that's given out by the Neighborhood Environment Committee. Before, we only have a minute or so left, and I want to just touch on Bill Rogers and some of the concepts that he came up with.
Well, Bill Rogers was the chair of Q in the mid-'80s, and he was really known as being the champion for winter city ideas, both getting our cities to be more user-friendly, not just skyways, but whole ways of designing buildings and neighborhoods to make them more pleasant to be in the winter, as well as more lighting, you know, fun things happening in the winter. He was also Mr. Anti-Mosquito. We worked with the county a bit on that to get more attention to mosquito control.
So very much a livability issue for this fellow.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time, and I know this is probably unfair to a professional, but in a few words, our urban forest, how is it here in Minneapolis? How would you characterize it?
Well, we're blessed with a city that has a very strong commitment to an urban forest. Considering that Dutch elm disease came in the 70s, we've got a tremendous number of elms, a great diversity of new trees, and they really add a tremendous amount to the livability as well as the beauty of the city.
Sounds positive.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peggy.
Okay.
Nice to have you here.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Well, we'll be back in a little bit with Janet Abrams from the University of Minnesota. But first, we're going to see a little moment from Joe Selvaggio. He was one of the Q jurors for the Q Awards last year, and he has something to say about livability here in the city.
Yes, I remember Q when it first started, and it meant kind of the beautifying, or primarily the beautifying of the city neighborhoods or what we see. And I thought that was a very good thing. I was executive director of Project for Pride in Living at the time, and so our mission was to have people take pride in their neighborhoods and their housing, and so this fit in very well. I think one of our sayings too was, we shape spaces and then our spaces shape us.
As the months go on, we'll be hearing more from Joe Selvaggio. He had a lot of good things to say about the connection between community and our urban environment. Welcome back. I am Phill Lindsay, and you are watching On Cue. And I'm very pleased to have as our next guest, Janet Abrams. It's nice to have
Phil.
you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Janet is the director of the Design Institute at the University of Minnesota. And just saying that sounds great. What is it?
The Design Institute is one of the 5 strategic academic initiatives that President Mark Yudof, who is now, of course, leaving to be Chancellor of the University of Texas, has really bequeathed to the university. The Design Institute is the smallest in terms of capital from the state legislature, but we are doing a great deal with it. It has a number of objectives and, if you like, constituencies, and I see those as a series of concentric rings, let's say starting with the university itself, which is the undergraduate, graduate population, the faculty and staff. The Institute, in that respect, is conceived of by President Yudof as an interdisciplinary platform that connects ideas and people across the university. All campuses and all departments are grist to the mill of the Design Institute, and he envisioned it as a place where the common ground between them is conceptually designed, so that it could be that somebody working in computational mathematics or in economics or in philosophy of language is doing some kind of design, and the job of the Institute is to root out all of those ideas makers and create a place of common discussion, as well as with obviously the design professors in those formal departments.
Specific disciplines.
The architecture,
Sure.
landscape architecture, which are in the Minneapolis East Bank campus. Design, housing, and apparel is on the St. Paul campus. They have interior design, graphic design, furniture design,
Right.
apparel design, and the Goldstein Museum. So there's a whole range of formal design degree programs, but the Institute has a wider remit.
And that's the
That's
the
ring
first
number
concentric
1.
ring.
Exactly.
Well, briefly, what are the other rings that you
I have
reach?
really come into this with an eye to the public realm as our place of work, of our canvas of activity. It's one thing to foment this discourse at a very high intellectual level within the academic environment, but to me it's very important that those ideas go out and that a connection is made between the university and its immediate milieus, which is the Twin Cities. Obviously it has a remit to the whole of the state, since the base funding is from Minnesotans, and yet it also has a goal to present the university to a much wider audience nationally and internationally. And I think each of the initiatives, and certainly I can see the Design Institute as having a mandate to be a center of excellence for the field of design worldwide, and we're doing that in a number of ways. So actually the Institute, in a physical sense, is just a few people full-time in an office on the East Bank, and active around us are a whole group of fellows and participants who we fly in. We kind of nicknamed the group that took part in the design camp, for example, at the end of July for teens aged 14 to 17, as a flying squad. I mean, it sounds a bit military almost, but we're mixing and mingling a resident faculty and a dispersed faculty, and at the same time we're trying to address audiences that are both local, on campus, and within the cities at large.
And for something I saw in your materials, amongst all those different constituencies, you're interested in a youthful interest.
Well, obviously, because the world we live in now is the result of designs that have been created over, tens, hundreds, thousands of years. But the next generation of designers the ones who are in school, you could extrapolate what they're going to create because they're influenced by the current generation of their professors. What we would like to get is more of an awareness of design by youngsters who haven't even begun to think what they'll do with their lives.
Yeah.
But to make them excited and aware of their ability to change the world they occupy.
Yeah.
And that means not just physically, but in organizational terms. And that's another area of design that's very important that we get across as part of our goal, is to shift the understanding of what design is from producing nice, round, colorful artifacts that you can buy and, surround yourself with at home or in your place of work, or the means of transport that you get to and from those activities, or the public spaces that you share, City Hall or a library or a sporting facility. It's not just those, it's the organizations and the institutions who commission those and represent themselves through those spaces and artifacts. And designing those social relationships is also part of what we're looking at.
And on that note, I noticed also something that kind of stuck out. Conflict resolution.
As a definition of design.
In terms of design.
Right.
Talk about that.
I came to this position after many years, really a couple of decades, as a critic and writer about architecture, urban design, and then the other myriad fields of design that we've listed. And it occurred to me over time that there are so many good examples of design, whether it's a tea kettle or a car or a private home. There are lots of, at any given moment, there are so many opinions, if you like, about what's good as well as what's bad, that it's really quite hard to say that there is a sort of consistent thing that is good design. It's related to economics, to politics, to the way people value their relationships with each other and inscribe those materially. And I began to realize that then design is a process itself, and it's about a kind of compromise state. The object that you get, the tea kettle that you might buy at a major store is not the last word in kettle design. It's just the provisional statement that was arrived at by the forces that came together in the company that manufactured it, the store whose buyer decided to stock it because it was available at some trade fair amongst other competing models. This is just an example. Mm-hmm. So design is the negotiation of all those values and interests, and it's bringing them together as best as possible, and then the designer, the formal industrial designer, takes those interests and translates them into form that you and I have at home on our stovetop.
And to me,
that's just a very modest example.
A modest example, but
prosaic.
I think it illustrates the ability of people who pay attention professionally to design to get out in the world and help people change their lives.
Exactly, and if you take this notion of conflict resolution and apply it to the domain of public transit or the domain of infrastructure in a city, it's not about conflict as aggression, it's about conflict as bringing parties together and airing points of view and then producing through iterations of possible forms a place and an object or an amenity that satisfies as many people as possible, as many as can be represented as possible.
Inspiring.
Janet,
thank you very much.
I enjoyed it.
Pleasant to have you here. Well, I'll be back to wrap up the show in just a moment, but first let's go out on the street and listen to some persons on the street talk about features here in the Minneapolis area.
My favorite building or natural structure is the old courthouse, the city hall.
Actually, everything is wonderful over here.
We like the Fache because it's fun to go all the way up there, and the people in there are very nice.
They are very, very nice.
Oh, I like those waterfalls. Those got the many high falls.
I like Barnes & Noble.
Well, my favorite building is the Wells Fargo Center.
Calhoun, Lake Calhoun.
I'd have to say the AT&T Tower.
My favorite built or natural structure in Minneapolis would probably be the new post office building a couple years ago.
The Stone Arch Bridge. That's my favorite thing.
I like the lakes.
The band show at Lake Harriet. There's a whole lot of things. Of course, I love the Sculpture Garden.
It has to be the Marquette Hotel.
I like downtown, too, to a degree, but, I don't really do a lot of shopping and stuff down here, though.
I think the Lock and Dam.
My favorite built or natural structure is actually the Hennepin Bridge.
Well, I live on the West Bank, so I love that neighborhood.
Well, those are a few comments from folks about their favorite feature here in Minneapolis. I think mine would be the chain of lakes. I like that a lot. Well, thanks for watching this premiere edition of On Cue. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the show or the Minneapolis Committee on Urban Environment, you can call for information, 612-673-3014. I thought I'd mention that one of the committees, the Urban Design Committee, has produced its first communication #1 about community corridors here in Minneapolis. Well, I'm Phill Lindsay. Thanks for watching On Cue. It's great to be back.